Hi folks, I'm Alan Watts and this is Cutting Through the Matrix. Your education is indoctrination for big agendas which you're unaware of. Absolutely. And you certainly don't want to end up being part of the swarm on the street. You pick on the weakest person, an old person or something. Somebody jumps on them and then you'll see them swarming like a hive. Woof, kicking in the boots and the whole thing. Very, very brave people. That's what the crowd does. The crowd is not something, there's no sanity, it's a primal, primitive thing that takes over in the crowd. I mentioned it too in last week's, I was on with Neil last Wednesday, I think it was, from the Irish Sentinel. And they got hacked big time. And the streaming got cut short because it didn't stream at all, in fact. And luckily I managed to record at my end. And eventually put it up. It took a lot of work because I used an old system I hadn't used for a few years to do the recording, so it wasn't the cleanest. But yeah, I've had the same problem with my computer systems too. If you speak out about what's happening today, you're hammered. Even my internet provider hammers me and throttles me and chokes me off absolutely until literally when you're at stalling speed, when your internet should cut out altogether, it crawls. It's worse actually at times than dial-up. And when you phone, there's no point phoning them up. They'll give you the runaround, but they're being told to do it. Of course they are, you know. You don't speak, you can't speak your mind up to date. There's no freedom of speech. You're under a totalitarian system. And if you look at even the Event 201, they came out with the warm-up, and the one even 2 years before it, they had two, the warm-up to the present so-called pandemic, with the same players that were attended at the Johns Hopkins rehearsal, you might say, dress rehearsal. They said they would attack folk eventually that wouldn't shut up and were trying to say something else to the general public. They went through the scenarios of even having false news out there 2 years before it happened. All prepared for it. Here's how we treat them all. And then they'll block off your money, your income. Then they'll block off your ability to talk to the public, silence you. And you've seen it all happen to lots of people. I get the same kind. I've had the same thing here for years before the pandemic, but that's what happens. You don't live in a free society. At all, you know. You'll be left alone if you're just watching pornography and stuff that they want you to watch and do things what they want you to do. Come on, no problem. You're safe then. I can remember, again years ago, an old preacher in the States, and he used to come out. He's got a character, you know. Very few characters amongst them. They're all rather like peas in a pod, but he was a real character. And he said, you know, he says, Satan will leave you alone. He says, if you're just one in the crowd and doing, you know, like everybody else. He says, only when you start to say there's something really evil with the system that you'll start to get problems. That's pretty well how it is, isn't it? You're left alone if you're one of his own, as they say. But if you're trying to break away, then now you're a target. Because you're beginning to see, you know. You're beginning to see. As I said before too, that, and I mentioned it last Wednesday doing that talk, that eventually I put it myself for the Irish Sentinel. But the absolute comparison of a psychopath with demonology. And I have no problems talking about demonology. I don't care who poo-poos it. It's like everything else. You can poo-poo everything unless you've maybe experienced it. At kind of close range at times. So who cares who poo-poos it and wants it or scientific? Look at the incredible deception you're under right now with science. You're going to parrot that all day long, eh? Well, they said COVID's real and we're all going to die if we don't take a shot, you know? And you watch cops beating up folk and strangling folk because they won't put a mask on. And I'll put some of these clips up too at cuttingthroughthematrix.com. Quite a few little clips. I don't use YouTube too much. I can't get any speed because I'm getting so heavily choked, but I get little bits sent to me and so on. So I'll put them up. And even one from a doctor, another doctor woman who's pretty good. She's straightforward in what she's talking about. I think her name is Mages, but I'll put her one up as well. But I have no problem talking about demonology. And I mentioned that Malachi Martin was one example. And it's so paradoxical, really, isn't it? How at one point he definitely was paid, and he was paid by a group inside the US to really build up ammunition for an enemy of Vatican II who wanted to use it for their own agenda. And he was in the payroll, and he wrote something about, under different names, Brother Seraphim, he published a book, and hit his own church, and it was used against the church, and the church never recovered. I don't see the church was ever perfect. The church, like every system, became corrupt long ago. It doesn't mean it all became corrupt. But we know for even during the communist years in the 30s and the 40s and the 50s, during the American un-American activities commissions that they had, they found a woman. I remember talking about her years ago, and she admitted that her job as a communist organizer was also a selector. She selected people for different projects inside America. They put them into politics naturally, but they also had other ones to go into the priesthood. And she was picking particular ones that had certain persuasions to go into the priesthood. And that did come out, by the way. This is not happenstance or hearsay. This is, you can actually look it up and read the inquiries about it at the time. And she put hundreds of people into the priesthood that shouldn't have been there. They end up having their cabals. They're still affecting the reputation of the Catholic Church to this day. They're really, But again, Malachi Martin, as I say, he also talked about the CIA. You can see an old documentary by, when he was on as a guest, being interviewed by William Buckley Jr. Now, William Buckley Jr. was admitted after he died that he was also in the CIA, like many folk in the media. But in the actual interview, Malachi Martin talked about the CIA being awfully... He talked about the same thing when he was on the Art Bell show, that the CIA used lots of priests as intelligence sources because they were across the whole planet into countries that were also communist and enemies and so on. So I'm pretty sure Malachi Martin was well involved in that too. So he's a guy who eventually, as a Jesuit, ends up doing what many Jesuits have done, which was damage the church. And in one big way, ends up writing books about possession and demons and demonology. Awfully good book to read, by the way, even if it's just psychology they're into. You can certainly get a lot from it. But you can get Hostage to the Devil, awfully good graphic observations, interpretations of mental states at the very, very least, right, and behavior. Which can all, of course, psychiatrists have put down as mental illness to the bitter end. It wouldn't make it matter what happened. It'd be the bitter end. It'd be mental illness of some kind or another. And, but you the other side of it too is a derangement by other forces. But when you put them down side by side, the possession, like perfect possession, is one category of possession, which is where a person is completely at home with the spirit or entity that's is in them. They're content and they can work well together. The problems in standard classical demonology is where a person is still fighting and not completely taken over by the entity that's in them. And there's a bit of resistance still there. Their indefinite anxiety all the time, maybe erratic behavior of all kinds in the process too, often similar to say, the old bipolar or manic depressive disorders as well. That's very similar. Sometimes, but odd behaviors always, you see. But when a person has deliberately taken an entity on board and sorted out. It's a different kettle of fish. And when you have an elite, not all of them, I mean, who knows, but if you have an elite group that literally, maybe intergenerationally, have taken these things on board, definitely they put out suggestions that some of the organizations they're into through the last century and a half, in occultic sort of sense with it, or even in the last couple of hundred years, in fact, or more. Some branches, especially French Freemasonry, they had some branches within there, and in London, of course, with the Hellfire Club. You definitely had this idea of eugenics, number one, of selective breeding, special breeding, mating for different purposes than just being horny, put it that way. But they actually create a type of a child. You find it going way, way back even to John Dee and the magical child that was eventually repeated all the way up to Crowley. So you're looking at something a bit different from that, from the usual horror movie interpretation of it. So eugenics is definitely involved in it to an extent. When the Hellfire Club, like some of the top Masonic groups in Britain, had brothels attached to them. Not any old brothel. It was just for certain members. And some of them were selected because, and they're called dollies. The dolly is a carrier. A dolly, just like anything that you push to carry luggage on, it's a carrier. They carried the genes, particular genes of higher families and so on. And part of the upper admission into some of the, and I'm not making this stuff up, this is from their old books and so on, was that you would be given permission to mate with a particular one until she was pregnant, and then she would have an offspring, you see. And from one of these dollies, the carriers of the right kind of genes, you know. And I could go on about that because it's an interesting field of eugenics. And we also know too that Charles Darwin was the offspring between the Darwin family and the Wedgwood family, because they've been doing it already for a few generations, and after him too, still doing it. Just intermarrying with the same one family for special genetic breeding of what they claim as the better traits, make them special. That continued right up into the 20th century, and I'm sure it still happens today with certain groups of them. And that's documented. It's not conspiracy at all. It's just documented history. And when his wife died, I think he married, it was his mother's sister or something. It was something, it was really real in breeding for sure. And it's often thought that's part of the problem with the Darwins, because they end up having tremendous headaches. It was hereditary. And then when they cross-matched into the Huxley family as well later on, which they did, and intermarry eventually that way, a lot of them had tremendous headaches, and they were bedridden with them, and depressions, you know. So these were hereditary traits that would be passed on, you see, more so within breeding. So you have that. But now supposing you got another level, though, where you want to bring in the spirit, just like the ancient Egyptians talked about too, the opening of the mouth ceremony and so on, where they believed that it was a strange way of looking at things. It wasn't just reincarnation. It was transmigration of souls. Where if a father died, the Pharaoh, and the son was nowhere near, he was off in a different province, maybe examining the province or something like that, on some business, then they couldn't just have, there had to be a proximity factor to transfer the spirit to the Pharaoh. One of the parts, they had a 5-part soul, you see. One of the main parts, to put it into the sun. And so they would go through a ceremony, an elaborate ceremony, where they would say that they could store it in the mouth, you see, the opening of the mouth ceremony, in a statue, and then do the same thing, and then transfer it to the sun when he got home. Like a safe, put it in a safe for a little while. And, they had very elaborate ceremonies about all these kind of, it was very important to them anyway, because they had so many different parts of spirit and soul in Egypt. But that became kind of this idea really fascinated people in the 1800s, and they got into it, some of the different occultic groups. And we know too that Yeats and different people were heavily involved in the occults in their time as well. And much of the poetry, in fact, was put out actually ceremonies, for those who don't know it. You know, it's quite interesting when you can actually understand what they're about. But anyway, the idea was to bring something more important than you into your body. That's what Aleister Crowley was in. And he had a big following, remember, and lots of aristocracy were involved in it at that level too. And the artistic community, as usual, as well, were involved in it. It didn't quite die off, and then they had a revival in the late 1800s with Theosophy that tried to bring more and more and more of it and blend it with India. But there's always that element of the higher groups that go through elaborate ceremonies, even today, to bring a higher entity into some people. Remember, there's branches of Masonry that are pretty well atheistic as well. Remember that as well. Eh? But for the occultic groups, there are certain ones that went all the way. Often as an excuse, perhaps, for free sex as well and all the rest of it. But some of them still believed that there was that these were entities of superior beings they could bring into themselves, or people who had lived long, long before them. And some of the groups saw these entities as gods, ancient gods, you see. And it wasn't a unique idea at all. It flourished in ancient times, in the Middle East, and even in ancient Hebrew. Into Judaism, early Judaism too, they had this idea, a different view on good and bad, right and wrong, as they have today. Is different again, different changes. But when Judaism took on Kabbalism and really pushed it, the early ones saw these entities that could be used. Today, in Christianity, you look upon things as demons. But in Judaism, there were entities that you could call down if you knew their names. Again, it's very Egyptian in a way as well, or taken from Egypt and other areas around that area. Even previous to Egypt, in fact, I'm sure. Many, many thousands of years old, these ideas proliferated and were copied by different cultures down through time. But the idea was that especially when you worship people as gods, like Pharaohs, and it was unthinkable often for the people to believe that the Pharaoh's body died, so therefore what was in him, this powerful being inside him, the spirit, was dead too. So they would say that they would think it went on, as it could even be transferred to the son of the Pharaoh, and therefore they were looked upon as gods. Immortal gods. Even if one body died, they'd have another one to enter into. So you're into the same area as demonology. And as I say, John Dee was really into this. He learned the Kabbalah and Hebrew. He was a real devotee. And the idea was to call down these entities and use them. And not to be afraid of them, you see. With the idea that you could do that, if you knew the right, almost code words, like passwords like computers, you could make them do your bidding. That was the idea. That's the idea behind all magic. And of course, Aleister Crowley took the same idea that he didn't invent, and pushed it too into a more real practice, physical practice, into his little society they had around him. And that's continued up until they had a big explosion again with the New Age, as they call it, New Age, in the 1960s onwards with the hippies. They introduced all this stuff again, and again the Theosophy idea of blending spirit with science, which Blavatsky boasted about. That was their goal. Odd thing to say, isn't it? And it struck me when I was looking at the World Trade Organization and the World Economic Forum. They're all the same members, by the way, that run all these things. And again, reimagining humanity. And in it, of course, they have the whole idea of life extension, which they do have today. They've had it for quite a while. But I remember watching a little clip that someone sent me, and it was from Israel. And it was someone, it was a scientist, a well-known scientist over there, in a general talk. And there's a lot of people coming into the room as he started his talk, and they were kind of yapping away as the man was trying to speak. But he said, quite casually there, he says, of course you know that if you've got a spare $7 million that you to spend, he says, we can keep you alive till you're 140 today. That's what he said. So nonchalantly too, you know. No, he didn't elaborate and say it's with just lots of transplants and so on. It would entail a lot more than that, I'm sure. But it can be done. And I remember years ago too, I think it was David Suzuki mentioned it too in one of his TV talks when he was on about the same guy who compared humanity's levels of parasites, or really living off the dung of the ones above them. That's why we said it to his students. The dropping of the ones above them as we classified society. You know, he mentioned too that at one time that they could pretty well stop the time gene, the clock, and the gene, the genetic structure, and telomeres and so on at that time. That was years ago, if they wanted to. And I'm sure many folk have had it. We know that old man Rockefeller died when he died there a few years ago. I think he was 103. That he was still giving talks and traveling the world up until the end. You know, he didn't seem to have the old age illnesses like arthritis or stone deaf or blind or whatever. And he was able to stand and give his talks. I think it did come out he'd had a few heart transplants, maybe 3 of them or 4, who knows. But I'm sure there are a lot more to it than that, because they don't come down, if you notice, with senility either. Their arteries are cleaned out, and the blood flow is good, etc. Anyway, that's a whole different parcel of an area to itself. But the thing is, this drive for immortality, and don't think I'm getting off the topic about demonology, the drive for immortality, as I mentioned on that last Wednesday's show, Neil Foster and Reality Bites Radio, was that a demon is a bodiless entity. They can't experience anything unless it's inside a physical body. And then you have a whole range of senses that come into play in a physical body. That's heaven to a demon, you see. Otherwise, it's like an enclosed off. It's like something floating in the blankness of space. And it's living in its own mind. But if you put a demon into a body, then suddenly the wonders of sensation and experience comes into play. And therefore they don't want to leave it, you see. Or if they leave it, or if they've killed it, if the host is fighting and they kill it, then they want to move into another one immediately. So heaven to a demon is the physical world. For people who live in the physical world, their heaven is away from the physical world. It's the opposite. Which is interesting to me in a way. It's like what you have Jesus say in the New Testament. He says, my kingdom is not of this world. Yeah? So, a whole religion is based on a different world for a spirit to go to, you see. But a demon wants the opposite. It comes from another world, another realm, and wants to exist permanently here. Well, look at the elite and look at the drive, using all your tax money for experimentation for the last couple of 100 years at least, big time, for life extension for themselves. Right down to possible, not just even creating clones for each other. That's been a big drive for a long time. Oh my God, they said in the 90s, we could probably create clones for ourselves and just keep them for body parts. This is how they explained it to the public. They had big pushes on this, by the way, and don't think that they had never done it. The laws that they don't go by the laws they give for you, you know. They have authorized institutions for themselves way above all of this. And then you had movies like The Island to do with them even cloning body parts, getting, I'm sure they're a good chuckle at all that kind of thing. And not to be confused with there's other old movies called The Island. It's a different thing. That was from Dr. Moreau's Island, an old idea of experimentation. I think H.G. Wells did it too. The Island of Dr. Moreau. So anyway, a demon wants to live forever in this world. You look at the elite and the drive they have to live permanently and stop the time clock in this world. They've had so many articles out, and in their books as well, not just magazines, and for general television and so on. So many articles about that very thing, that it'd be wonderful for them to live forever and just stop the time gene, maybe at the age of 25 or something, So you'd be the peak of health, and you'd never age. You would never come down with old age illnesses. Your eyes, and your eyesight should be as good at the age of 500 as it was when you actually hit 25 and they stopped the time clock, What you're looking at is what a demon would want. To live forever in the physical world, isn't it? That is its heaven. So you can toss things around all you want, and I don't mind tossing all these ideas around my head. I have no problem with them at all. I have no problem with folk who will ridicule it either, or say, oh, he's a fanatic or a nutcase. I don't care what folk think about it. It's something you think about, isn't it? When you see the similarities, as I said before, things quack like a duck and walk like a duck. It's generally a duck. So regardless of how you want to define it, it is the same process that something is after, for the same reasons, isn't it? Psychopathic, mental illness, demonology is so similar, isn't it? And so I wouldn't poo-poo things that easily if I were you. I really can't imagine the people who formed the Bolshevik slaughter teams that are well documented by themselves and by the orders put out by Lenin to these groups as being basically just pure. If that's what human is, you understand we're done for. If humans are the cold-blooded humanistic types of psychopaths, call it that, that are atheistic, they have no problems eating that God is dead, therefore everything that was impossible is now possible. If that's what humans are, we're in big trouble. And the more you start to believe that is their sciences, that is the sciences. Humanism is the new religion. It's a good thing. You better say, God help us, because nothing else will, because you'll go along with their terrible plans. I really mean that. The Bolsheviks, as I've said, were given instructions, just like Antifa right at the moment. You're actually seeing very carefully constructed Bolshevik techniques being used right now by design. It's not by accident. And Lenin said, he said, to get the little farmers all on board here, to terrify them into submission and to give up all their crops and all their rights and their property and their religion and to accept us as the dominant force of government. It says just go into little towns and villages, pick people who have more say or who are looked up to. They don't have to be wealthier even than the average peasant. Just pick them, a few of them, maybe 5 per village or more, and horribly execute them. And order that everybody must attend their execution. And what they did, they cut the intestines, the small intestines, at the lower part where it touched the large intestine, and brought it out of the abdomen. They would tie them to posts in town and make the person walk round and round and round as it unraveled. And this is the truth, folks. I know it's unpleasant, But you understand something? Horror always repeats itself unless you're willing to look at horror in the face. Otherwise, you're not going to stop it happening again. And that's how they watched them until the people just fell down dead. Horrible, terrible pain and horrible. And believe you me, that technique had everybody on their knees to communism very quickly. Horrible, isn't it? This isn't made up. This is, you can find the old writings, disclosed stuff from the old communist archives too, in the Soviet Union. And that's where humanism will get you, because there's nothing else to elevate humanity as something special. And regardless of what religion you're looking at, religion always appealed, especially to young people. When you're willing, you're not jaded with the drudgery or the nastiness of everyday life by those who rule you. It wears you down. And you're optimistic perhaps because you're young and you feel great and you're healthy, you hope. But you do know that there's something beyond all of this. Every child goes through it. I think almost every child goes through it, what they used to. Where they look into areas that were looked down upon by the general religions. But they would at least look into them and say, what if, and maybe it could be, and blah, blah, blah. And you just know, because your intuition, it isn't just intuition at that stage. There's another element where you'd sit with your buddies, you know, and you'd start singing the same line of a song at this precise moment the other person would start singing, out of the blue. Hadn't thought about it all day, it would just come out. Things like that. And then you look at each other and laugh. That's so common when you're young. You're unfortunately with this system, it's knocked out of you so quickly by the system. Because it's a clue there's something else beyond the basic 2 and 2 equals 4 here. There's another element to it. And it's the same element that would guide you in to deeper truths to do with a belief system that accepts something called the supernatural. And it's a supernatural that gave you, that accepted and gave you rights as a human being. A human being wasn't something that would just be slaughtered because you're in the way of progress, like it is in an atheistic society. You understand? And humanism, there's no reason why an authority shouldn't eliminate you if you're in the way of anything. There's no morality there. Morality comes from your acceptance of something bigger than yourself. And if you accept something bigger than yourself that you are aware of, then you're aware that this bigger thing gives the rights to other people as well, other humans as well. It's part of the affinity you have as a human being for others. Don't forget Julian Huxley. You should read what he wrote about for UNESCO in his speeches too. He mentioned them. What he talked about society and how he says we will have to knock humanity off its pedestal as being a superior species on the planet with all of its rights in order to dominate and change society and guide it. Who's the we he's talking about here? Huh? This is the same guy that was a co-founder of Planned Parenthood. But we have to knock us off. Well, once you're knocked off, and they tell you and convince you through the countless TV programs, with the furry animals, that you're just another furry animal. Maybe furry if you're not bald. But yeah. And once you start to believe it, I'm sure you all know folk who went maybe in college or school or even afterwards, they went along with something. Oh well, we're just animals. And these same people, would never be upset if someone was being abused by a system in their own or other countries. It wouldn't upset them. It's just so, because that's where you end up when when you accept and you've come to conclude you're just an animal. Well, animals don't do this to other animals, what humans do. Don't forget, animals generally don't even kill other animals in a fight. And what they will fight about are very basic things. Very basic things. Mates, for mating. Food. Very few needs, you see. But humans are not the same. We can plan wars. Wars that go to almost a level of extinction sometimes. Because we have a different brain. And we're awfully good at creating things, machines of destruction. Oh, we're awfully good at that, eh? Oh, look at all these COVID ideas. Look what broke out of the information that broke out from all the labs, eh? But I was giving these talks years ago, but I said my biggest fear is not the atom bomb. It's the biowarfare industry. And they really do have things which really could wipe us out. The only reason they don't really give out their really lethal stuff is because they don't want to kill themselves either. Even if they have real vaccinations against them, which they actually have created, by the way, in the biolabs. You can't do one change in gain of function from one part to the next without having an antidote to each part of it. That's something they don't tell you in the media these days, eh? They used to. That's the law. But they still don't trust it even for the elite themselves in case the thing did mutate afterwards and still kill them. So that's the only reason these things haven't been let loose en masse. They've been well tested in different places across Africa, I'm sure. Where a lot of them break out, supposed to just break out, eh? And can be awfully easily observed and contained and kept quiet often too, through bribery. But the world is a nasty place. Because the people who rule it, you have to ask yourself, are they really just people? Or are they, again, okay, you say, oh, fine, in an atheistic society, they're just atheistic humanists. They see no problem with, and a bit of psychopathy there, and have no problem in eliminating enemies or folk to stand in the way to get their big agendas through. Now, the studies on psychopaths also, as we understood, that when they rule societies, and they've taken it over even long ago through intermarriage, conquerors would marry the daughters of conquerors, and then you end up with awfully good psychopathic conquerors, right? But you end up with in a materialistic system where you elevate them up to be ultra rich and you worship them and then you've got a massive media which they also own that constantly praises them and say how wonderful. Most folk already worship the celebrities not because they're any good at it, because they're rich. They're stinking rich. So you've been given a materialistic culture based on materialistic religion, in a sense. It becomes a religion, and it's humanistic, and they're important. You've been conditioned to see these people are important, and as you go down the sliding scale to little old you, then you're not so important. You're getting the point here. It's quite easy to condition the public into that mode of being. I guess I'm not so important after all. And then your choices eventually when you're laid off from work, and it's because it's all been given by the elite to China in the Far East. They end up on the street somewhere, hopefully in a warmer place, because there'll be murder in the winter. Or you can take drugs and speed up their death that way, which they make sure are well supplied. You're living in an amazing system, Look at the police forces of the world let loose upon people who might not want to wear a mask, or they can't wear a mask. No, that does any good. It's got nothing to do with it working. Cops like to beat folk up who won't comply with the herd. It's a uniformity. You don't just wear a uniform, you become uniform. It's a uniformity of society. So they don't like anything that doesn't comply. And when they're given permission to beat you up, they go with it with gusto, Sometimes they'll enjoy their work then. That's the kind that will go and apply for those kind of work. Especially today, they've been brought up in the same Xboxes as the generation that goes into the military. Don't forget that. There's no moral questions in war games and Xboxes. It's just how many folk can you kill and can you win. That's it. End of that problem, right? But so they'll get let loose on the folk where they won't wear a mask. And you can see what's happened. They'll strangle them, they'll beat them on the head. I've got another video, I'll put up a guy in a subway, I think it was. And he said he had, like most of them, have permission not to wear a mask because they've got bronchial problems and asthmas and different things. That makes no difference to these cops. Because you see, they pick on easy prey. These same cops won't go near a Black Lives Matter revolution across Britain and other countries that's got nothing to do with what happened in America. And it's getting used for other purposes, as you know. These cops won't know where to be seen. But they'll pick on some lone character in a subway and they'll jump on them and beat them up and damage them, and that's okay. Or some woman in Australia, you see one where she's getting strangled, another one that was trying to organize an anti-mask and anti-lockdown movement, it busted into her home and grabbed her and arrested her too. Another guy did the same thing too, who didn't go to the meeting, eventually tried to call it off, and they busted into his house with a battering ram. But when it came to other big peaceful demonstrations, let's call it that way, nowhere to be seen. Nowhere to be seen. What works through them? It's the same herd mentality. It's the crowd again, where they'll jump on the easy victim. It's the same thing, they'll say, with a woman who gets followed to be raped by somebody, that rapists somehow sense the personality that they're after. Maybe, who knows, maybe the way they walk or something tells them they're not so confident, or I've known what, I haven't really studied it, but you'll see these different articles on studying the victim, what makes the people pick that particular woman. And right down to pheromones and things like that. But it's the same thing with the crowd. You'll see in Portland and Kenosha, you'll see these folk at night with skateboards too. You notice have these skateboards, the guys that scout around looking for targets and things like that. And they pick someone that's easy to pick on, and immediately you'll see a bunch of them just moving in for the kill, you know. That's they're cowards on their own, but it's a swarming. That's what they call it, swarming. But cops can do the same thing again on the general public when they're given permission, you see. So you have to really stand back and see what kind of world that we're living in, what kind of world do we want right now, and what's running this world at the top, at the very top. You remember, and it's not laughable. I mean, there's no such thing as conspiracy theory when you have the facts that the media themselves, the same ones that call you conspiracy theorists, come out with them and tell you about it. I can remember years ago when Prince Charles talked about being part of the Olympians. He was an Olympian, he said. Well, he wasn't talking about running a mile. Charlie couldn't run 10 yards, but he's an Olympian. It's a big group, of the higher gods, the idea of the gods, back in the Occult. And Aleister Crowley is an example and back in the ancient Hebrew, where they could bring down a demon and use them for their own purposes. A god. They believed they were gods, you see. And that's still in the occult religions of today, the idea of bringing down gods for different reasons, the gods of just in air, fire, and water, and so on. It's specific gods for specific reasons, and these are old religions. They really believe them. They don't believe there's any right and wrong, you understand? It's a matter of knowing the coding in Kabbalah and deep Kabbalah, and then into the really higher occults of demonology is, as I say, to call down the right kind of entities for the right kind of jobs and purposes to be used by you as a magician on other people. And they still have them through talismans today. If you go into Israel, you'll see certain rabbis actually really are dedicated to this particular field. It's interesting. So much so that their rooms are covered in talismans to protect them, just like any magi in any area, in any religion, in any era. Your big fear is having things come back on you by other magi that are opposing you, or maybe you've opposed them in the past. So you end up in a paranoid state where you're terrified to just go to sleep, you see. But you do have the people at the top who join these elite clubs, and they believe that they're, who knows what kind of ceremony a Charlie boy went through to come out as an Olympian, eh? Because the old idea of the Olympians were the gods up and high, like the Zeus and so on. They would look down. You'd have Hera there, and they look down on the little people, and they'd use the little people beneath them as playthings or chess pieces. If we look into ancient times, we'll find there's always stories in religions and histories about those who seek immortality, generally from the upper crust, because they have a life of luxury. They love life more than most folk. They have much better health generally because of best food. They get best food and warmth and accommodation. Things are taken care of by managers on their behalf, basically. Just like the modern ones too, the multi-billionaires and trillionaires have estate managers and business managers. All the problems are dealt with for them. They don't have to worry their little heads and get stressed out about things. It's all done for them. So they love life more than most people, you see. And they have life extension. They don't get old age problems because they've advanced medical treatments for things for themselves. And more than anything else, they love life more than most folk who are beaten down and worn down with it, or sick as well. Therefore, down through the ages, it's been kind of similar. Therefore, the elite, the ultra-elite, have always sought after immortality, and they have it written into stories and folklore and folk stories, and along with religions as well. So it's still here today. So you can take the atheistic point of view, the humanistic point of view. That's just part of human nature to want that forever. But what I'm pointing out is there more to it or not? Because there's a psychopath who really loves life, who's riding high on the backs of everybody else. They certainly do love life. They don't want to get off this planet here. And then you have other ideas to do with religion and demonology. I like to compare all these different things, regardless of what you want to believe or think about it. You should always look at all the different avenues that bring you to the same questions. As they're still doing the same today, aren't they? As they've been doing for thousands of years, by using us all for their own particular agendas, including, Julian Huxley and Transhumanism. He came out with the term in his own writings at the time, and it's been copied ever since, merging themselves through all the sci-fi movies you've seen, merging themselves into the computer system, the internet system, like the Lawnmower man. And even transferring their whole intellects, their whole awareness, their being with engrams in their brains into computers. It's all the same agenda, isn't it, by the same kinds of people. And you have to ask yourself what really does drive them, because they don't see themselves. I don't think they ever have seen themselves as a part of general society, like Bertrand Russell and his ilk. And he said that eventually the elite will be pretty well a separate species from the rest of the population. And here we are. So take your pick what you want to think about it, but don't rule out anything at all. But that's the kind of characters you have. Then you have the guys like Bill Gates, who is so full of himself. What is in this man? What is in, we used to say in literature, what possesses a man, eh? And it's maybe more to it than you think. But what makes him think he's got the right to reconstruct the world? And on whose behalf? Because he's a front man too, in his own particular field. There are certain ones that are the front distributors of big money to different NGOs and other organizations and corporations. And he's one of them. He's a distributor mainly than anything else. And a promoter of one particular area for himself, which is Gavi and vaccination. And he's said quite openly in his talks that it would also help reduce the population by giving vaccines out. So if you want to take vaccines that this man's had any finger in stirring up the vaccine pot, hubble bubble and toil and trouble, well, good luck to you if you still believe it. What a terrible thing to do is just to go ahead and accept it. When he said it himself, eh? And yes, once again, I'll mention the articles that have been in the newspapers, and I had them up myself on my site years ago. And gave the talks in it when he and Oprah and a bunch of them they nicknamed it the Lucky Gene Club as well, but they were there for eugenics. And they talked about overpopulation problems in the world. See, most ordinary folk would feel embarrassed about even going near a topic like that. If a group got together, just your friends and acquaintances, and you're just casually chatting about all kinds of things, and then, well, there are too many folk in the world, Well, what can be done about it? Well, but you'd always end up going back to square one where you just don't know what you could do about it, etc., etc. If you meet someone that says, well, I know what I'll do if I get any power, then you should really start to perk up and say, wait a minute, who are you? And who gives you the right to decide, eh? Huh? Don't forget that Kissinger put that ruling through for that was not a bill as such, but it was something to do with the state of the nation. And he said at the time, he says the greatest fear we have, the biggest enemy to the state is overpopulation. And he put the bill through. It was mainly aimed, folk thought at the time, towards third world countries. And that included not feeding them. That's just a big, eugenics comes up with these topics. It will bring you into these topics, if you even go near the topic. Should you feed these folk or not? That's what he said. He says, because folk are starving is not in itself a good reason just to feed them. He was talking about not just overpopulation, but places like Bangladesh, which at that time were heavily influenced by communism. So his idea was, if you feed them, you'll breed more communists. See? Everything's a weapon, isn't it? Everything you need is a weapon. Like food, I need food, therefore. Okay, therefore. That's how it goes. And guys like him, who work for a different agency than you'll ever imagine, they're way above the CIA, the top ranks of the CIA, just above it actually, go off in tangents that they're nothing to do with helping you as a country. Folk who are in the CIA and have been in it never figured it out themselves on the middle and lower levels as to why they've done so many things that did not benefit Americans at all. So yeah, you're living with a different system over you, but yeah, eugenics is an amazing field. When at the top, when you get rich folk who are awfully rich, who also belong to clubs that know that they have authority because they're so secretive, and it has everybody who's anybody in it that's got any kind of power at all in the financial area of the world, like the World Bank and the IMF and so on. And here they are discussing eugenics and ways to reduce the population. Well, when they say ways to reduce the population, they're including you all in it. I hope you understand. They're not saying, but they don't mean me. Oh yes, they do. And it isn't just about you having children. Because when you're saying, well, they don't mean me because you decided you don't have any children. No, you're a useless eater. They're eating and using up the Earth's resources. And they come out with all these different equations as how much carbon you produce in your lifetime just by existing. Little old you, eh? These are the monsters. These are the same monsters, by the way, that sat back and helped create the Soviet system, the revolution that slaughtered millions in Russia. Right through its whole existence. The same people, and it quickly goes through it as one branch of it, the Cancer and Foreign Relations, the helper group, I would say, and the outer circle of friends and so on. They were fascinated at the Royal Institute for International Affairs by the setting up. And when they called it the Milner Group at the time, that morphed into the Royal Institute for International Affairs. But they were fascinated by observing it as a big experiment on a a good part of that continent, this communist idea. Oh, let's slaughter all the folk who had any power, the middle class, and just wipe them all out and replace them with a different middle class, as you know. And then wipe out stacks and stacks of farmers to create a famine. And then when folk are starving, you can dictate to them and they'll jump to wherever if you offered them any kind of food at all, they'll jump. That's what they did. But they studied them. And the Bolsheviks were financed. They trained them, a lot of them in America. They'd run to America years before. These revolutionaries, what they called it, the International Revolutionary Party. They had big meetings in New York City in the open air. Read about it. You can see the old photographs yet. And they were trained on Standard Oil property. Some of them as a warrior class, the fighters, the army. And then they sent them over to Russia and let them loose. And then observed it all. Mass slaughter. And they called it the second great experiment. The first was America. The second one was a different system. It was to be a communistic system. And they studied them. And we fed them because they starved themselves. And we sent them clothing. And when the World Bank was up and running, it financed them for its entire existence. And we paid off a lot of their debt for its entire existence in the West with their taxes. Big experiment. How many millions of folk were slaughtered for this big experiment? Eh? Well, you better get through your heads. It's the same people and their descendants who run the Gates Group and the foundations, who run the World Economic Forum, who run the World Bank, the Bank for International Settlements, the IMF, the United Nations. It's the same group who own it all and run it all. And you're all part of the present big experiment as they go into the next technological, post-industrial and post-consumerist society, into austerity, forced austerity. You better start to understand what's really going on here. Because these people at the top of this lot, or even who are not at the top, like the Bill Gates, they're much higher than you, but they have no problem dictating what they're going to do with you all. And how you're going to be pincushions for vaccines by a law, which they run, that they're claiming. Or you're not going to be allowed to ever live the same way again. You can't go out of your home. You can't go out and shop. You can't do anything. It's their way or no way. Huh? For the rest of your life, whatever kind of life you're going to have. And they're going to make you wear identity bracelets, electronic ones, if you won't go along with it. And if you've got a smartphone, then you've got to have it with you everywhere you go because it's going to have the same function of monitoring you all the time. Total spy network system. They mean what they say, folks. Who gave them this right? These guys obviously believe that they are the gods. They can dictate to the rest of us. And they can either let your uniformed official cops, like that Australia's doing, let them loose on the general public with full force. Or in the West, they might just use revolutionary groups of youngsters that are, again, the misfits, most of them, who they're getting paid to do it too a lot. The leaders are, definitely, the leaders are. They get paychecks for it at the NGOs. At that level, they get well paid. The followers don't know, although they're getting their unemployment money to go right now. It's quite astonishing. But that's what they can use on the general public as they bring down America. Don't forget again where they want to bring America down to. They published it all, and so did Britain, with their strategic think tanks for the military Department of Defense. They want to bring it down to the city-state, get rid of the nation. So there'll be a few city-states in America. Huh? Remember that? It's all gone through your ears and out the other one again and gone, lost in a trail of exhaust or vapor. Vapor trail. How do you think they're going to get to that stage? Do you think they just imagine? Whatever they write in these programs, they plan it. And to plan it means you make it happen. The only thing is unthinkable because to you it's unthinkable. You would never do that. But these are the planners we're talking about. How would they get you to the same system? And I've mentioned it before. Isn't it odd that the Communist Manifesto has pretty well been completely, the planks of it, fulfilled, eh? With the starting off with the elimination of the family unit as an example. And then the youngsters are owned by the state. The state gives them their value system, as Russell said and others said too. Etc., etc., all the way down to eventually the withering away of the nation state. And that's exactly what the Royal Institute for International Affairs wanted, the Milner Group that ran the British Empire. Isn't it rather coincidental, do you think, eh? It's all the same endings that they have. Freemasonry, Albert Pike, the end of the family unit again, the end of private property. What a coincidence, eh? End of private property for all you lot, but not for the elite at the very, very top. I always love that little statement by George Orwell. Because he was on about utopias. They always give you utopias, you see, to you go along with it. He says some are more equal than others in such utopias. Well, that's always the way it's been. That's always the way it will be. Why should the ones who bring you carnage and destruction, for the good of all and the good of the people, not live better than you? That's the first thing they'll tell you. And eat better than you, and so on and so on. Never ending. Remember again, cuttingthroughthematrix.com, and send me a few bucks your way before you forget. And these are long talks, and I have one person only, and I know what he means. He's in England. He says it's too long for him. I think he's older, maybe. But he said that it's often harder for him to find out where he left off if he wants to continue the talk maybe the next day or something, or later on that day. And I know what he means. But the same token, these are emergency times. These are emergency broadcasts in a sense. Because I always knew it would come to this. I always did. And as I said before, we're going through incredible history. This is more profound than even World War II, by the way, for the changes that the system wants to make on itself on behalf of those who own it and rule it. And who are quite confident about it until you all just stopped going along with it. They can't do it without, again, with the greatest con, you've got to participate in it all for your own destruction. Without it, they can't do it.